October morning in 1944, a notebook was tucked under a cot in Camp Crossville, Tennessee. The handwriting belonged to a captured Luftwaffe pilot who had expected barbed wire, hunger, and humiliation. Instead, the entry opened with disbelief. Today we were given steak, eggs, and even ice cream. The guards ate the same. The shock of those lines set the stage for a wider story. One where men trained to see America as a land of chaos suddenly confronted a country overflowing with abundance. The journey to that camp had begun weeks earlier on the other side of the Atlantic. When Allied patrols swept across France, columns of German soldiers, some hardened veterans, others barely more than boys, were herded to waiting trucks. The prisoners whispered among themselves about their fate. Nazi propaganda had warned them that Americans treated captives no better than cattle, and some believed they might be executed outright. Yet the trucks rolled not toward execution pits, but toward clean railway stations guarded by military police. At Cherbourg Harbor, records show that nearly 3,000 prisoners were processed in a single day. The men boarded Liberty ships designed to haul tanks and munitions, but now repurposed to ferry human cargo across the Atlantic. The decks smelled of salt, oil, and boiled coffee from the galley. Each man was issued rations totaling around 3,000 calories per day, far more than the Wehrmacht had managed to supply in the field. Even the hard biscuits and canned beef seemed decadent compared to the watery turnip soup they had survived on during the retreat from Normandy. The Atlantic crossing carried its own surreal qualities. U-boats lurked in the depths, but the prisoners soon realized the Allies' convoy system was nearly impenetrable. They watched destroyers weave across the horizon and felt the steady vibration of engines designed to churn out thousands of tons of steel each week. Some whispered that no Reich could outbuild such an armada. Others remained stubborn, clinging to Hitler's promises of secret weapons. But when the lights of New York flickered into view, even the most defiant fell silent. The skyline loomed with 1,000 points of brightness. One POW later recalled smelling roasted chestnuts on the dock as American workers unloaded crates. It was the first time he had seen a city untouched by bombing. No collapsed roofs, no acrid smoke, no children carrying water buckets through rubble. Instead, electric lights burned without interruption. The hum of trolleys filled the streets. The prisoners looked at one another and muttered, "This is not how a nation near collapse behaves." Trains carried them inland at a pace that astonished men accustomed to Europe's strained rail system. Locomotives pulled hundreds of cars across hundreds of miles in a single night. Camp records note that one transport moved 1,200 POWs from New Jersey to Kentucky in less than 36 hours. The smell of coal smoke clung to their uniforms as the countryside passed in endless miles of farmland, barns stacked with hay, silos brimming with grain. The sheer scale of agriculture mocked Goebbels's broadcasts that America was starving. Arrival at the camps dismantled another illusion. Instead of open pens, the men found wooden barracks with heating stoves, electric bulbs, and even screening rooms where newsreels flickered on weekends. The smell of fresh pine from the lumber mixed with disinfectant, creating an atmosphere not of cruelty, but of enforced order. Each compound held a canteen stocked with cigarettes, writing paper, and soap, purchased with tokens earned through work. A chaplain often greeted new arrivals, offering services in German, and distributing Bibles or prayer books donated by local congregations. Still, it was the meals that left the most searing impression. Quartermaster logs reveal that camps allocated roughly 4,000 pounds of meat and 2,000 gallons of milk per week for each 1,000 prisoners. Breakfast trays held scrambled eggs, toast with butter, and steaming coffee. On Sundays, camp kitchens sometimes served fried chicken or steak, accompanied by mashed potatoes and green beans. And then there was dessert: apple pie in autumn, ice cream in summer, gelatin in bright colors that seemed almost theatrical to men raised in an era of shortages. The POWs compared these spreads not to field rations, but to the best family gatherings they could remember before the war. The sensory shock was overwhelming. One soldier later confessed that he could not shake the sound of the mess hall, metal trays clattering, laughter echoing from guards and prisoners alike, as he ate more calories in a single sitting than he had seen in days at the front. The taste of cold vanilla ice cream haunted him, because it felt impossible that a nation at war could waste milk and sugar on enemy soldiers. For him, it was not a sign of kindness, but of a terrifying surplus. American guards noticed the disbelief. Reports from Camp Swift in Texas described German officers repeatedly checking the food stores, convinced that rations were temporary bribes. Weeks later, when the pattern held, they began to accept that abundance was real. Some still sneered, insisting that the Allies were soft, that luxury would dull their fighting edge. Yet as newspapers circulated inside the camps, filled with reports of new divisions, new ships, new bombers, the logic faltered. How could softness produce such endless output? The contrast with Germany's own situation sharpened the shock. Letters from home, delivered through the Red Cross, spoke of bombed cities, of ration cards for bread and potatoes, of winter coats patched with scraps. Prisoners compared those accounts with the camp reality: warm showers, electric light that never flickered, and medical stations stocked with bandages and penicillin. Every sense reinforced the difference. They smelled disinfected sheets, saw refrigerators humming, and heard radios broadcasting jazz deep into the night. The sensory overload was not subtle. It was deliberate proof that America's war machine rested on more than guns. By late 1944, the United States housed over 400,000 German POWs in camps stretching from Georgia to California. The logistics alone were staggering. Railroads delivered thousands of tons of flour, beef, and produce each month to sustain the captives. Civilian contractors provided everything from uniforms to kitchen utensils. For the prisoners, the scale of that organization became its own weapon, more convincing than any lecture. If the enemy could afford to feed steak to its captives, what did it feed its frontline troops? Not every man was persuaded. Hardcore ideologues scoffed that the displays were theatrical illusions meant to weaken morale. Some organized secret cells within the camps, punishing comrades who seemed too impressed. But the diaries tell another story. A corporal from Hamburg wrote that he had begun to fear less for his own safety than for the future of Germany. He described the taste of butter melting into cornbread, a trivial detail, yet one that convinced him the Reich's promises of plenty were empty. The first winter confirmed the lesson. While German civilians scoured forests for firewood and huddled in basements, the camps in America delivered fuel oil by the gallon and distributed blankets in neat stacks. Prisoners played soccer on cleared fields, their shouts echoing under the pale sun. Guards monitored but rarely interfered. When Christmas arrived, chaplains organized services with carols, and kitchens prepared turkeys. 1,500 pounds of poultry in one camp alone. The smell of roasted meat and cinnamon pies drifted across the barracks. Even the most stubborn veterans admitted that no propaganda could have prepared them for such scenes. Yet this was only the beginning. The real revelation would not be limited to food or shelter, but to the machinery of America itself, the shipyards, the factories, the power grids that seemed to pulse endlessly. That, the prisoners would soon see, was where the true shock awaited. What they witnessed next would overturn not only their expectations of captivity, but their entire sense of what a modern nation could accomplish. The shock of the camps was only a prelude. In 1944 and 1945, German prisoners began to glimpse the engine that made such abundance possible. They were not only fed, they were shown through labor details and guarded trips, the industrial heart of America. For men who had grown up in the shadow of Krupp's smokestacks and Hitler's speeches about destiny, the discovery was jarring. They expected crude assembly sheds or propaganda tours. What they found instead were factories that roared like entire cities, shipyards that poured steel into the sea, and power grids that lit towns brighter than anything they had known at home. The first impression often came from the railroads themselves. Each transfer from camp to worksite reinforced the scale. Locomotives thundered with 80 or 90 cars, hauling wheat, coal, and machine parts without pause. Quartermaster notes reveal that by late 1944, American trains moved nearly 2 million tons of freight per day. The prisoners stared from their guarded cars, watching endless lines of tankers, boxcars, and passenger coaches pass in both directions. The smell of diesel and hot iron clung to the stations. One sergeant admitted in his diary that the sheer number of locomotives convinced him Germany's war was unwinnable. "We cannot even keep one line clear under bombing," he wrote, "and here they run hundreds." Came the shipyards. At places like Newport News and the Gulf Coast yards, prisoners watched Liberty ships rise from keel to launch in a matter of weeks. The clang of rivets echoed like gunfire, but here it was a rhythm of creation, not destruction. Records from the Maritime Commission show that in 1943 alone, 2,110 Liberty ships were produced, an average of 7 each day. For Germans who remembered the slow birth of a single cruiser back home, the pace was unimaginable. They smelled fresh paint, oil, and tar, and they saw hulls slide into water faster than their own navy could ever replace losses. The image burned into memory. A flotilla of gray steel, each loaded with thousands of tons of supplies, each evidence that no blockade could choke America. Factories offered another revelation. Some prisoners assigned to agricultural equipment plants or machine shops found themselves in buildings that stretched longer than parade grounds. At Willow Run in Michigan, a single facility sprawled across more than 3.5 million square feet, producing B-24 bombers at the rate of 1 every 63 minutes. Even those who never entered its gates heard the legend repeated among guards, an airplane every hour, day after day. The smell inside, oil, rubber, hot metal, was the perfume of industrial might. German engineers among the captives marveled at conveyor systems and standardized parts. They whispered that such efficiency was not a trick for visitors, but a permanent reality. Wages also startled them. Civilian workers who lived near the camp spoke freely. A missionist could earn $1.20 an hour, sometimes bringing home $50 a week. Compared to a German soldier's pay, barely enough for bread and postage, the figures seemed outlandish. At a Texas camp, one POW recorded that guards joked about saving for cars, while in Germany, families sold jewelry for potatoes. The contrast was not abstract. It was measured in dollars and cents, in paychecks and savings bonds. America's workers could buy radios, shoes, and canned fruit even during wartime rationing. Germany's workers counted out ration coupons and lined up for turnips. The sensory differences were constant. Supermarkets near the camps displayed piles of oranges, bananas, and tins of coffee. The smell of fresh bread wafted from bakeries, and neon signs buzzed above diners open past midnight. Prisoners remembered Berlin blackout curtains, the stench of ersatz bread made with sawdust, and the silence of ration queues. Here, teenagers drank milkshakes while jukeboxes played. It was not the propaganda of posters, but the lived reality of a society whose production seemed limitless. Numbers confirmed the impression. U.S. steel output in 1944 reached 89 million tons, more than Germany and Japan combined. Electric power generation exceeded 200 billion kilowatt-hours that year. And food production astonished the prisoners most of all. American farmers harvested nearly 4 billion bushels of corn, alongside mountains of wheat and soybeans. One POW at a Kansas farm recounted in a letter that a single combine covered more ground in a day than an entire German village could manage in a week. The roar of its engine and the smell of cut grain embodied what he called a world without shortages. The Red Cross and camp newspapers spread these figures further. German officers tried to forbid discussion, but curiosity could not be contained. Men compared notes about factories in Illinois, oil fields in Oklahoma, and power plants in Tennessee. At Oak Ridge, some glimpsed the secret city's electrified fences and constant deliveries of graphite and uranium ore, though few knew its purpose. What struck them was the scale. Entire towns built overnight, powered by grids that seemed to glow without end. Even without details, the sense of colossal energy was unavoidable. Everyday abundance amplified the industrial awe. In mess halls, rations remained consistent: meat, potatoes, vegetables, fruit, and dessert. When guards mentioned that sugar was rationed for civilians, POWs laughed bitterly. The ration still allowed Americans nearly 8 pounds per person per month, luxury by European standards. In one camp, prisoners noted that even stray cats grew fat on leftovers. The smell of frying bacon in the mornings haunted men whose families back home received margarine and watery cabbage. Consumer goods sealed the lesson. Sears catalogs circulated in some camps, offering glimpses of suits, dresses, radios, and even houses. One POW underlined prices in astonishment. A pair of shoes for $3.95, a washing machine for under $50. The catalog pages smelled of ink and paper, but to the prisoners they carried the scent of impossible prosperity. They debated whether Americans were decadent or simply efficient beyond comprehension. Some concluded that propaganda had lied. Others insisted that such plenty must collapse under its own weight. Yet none could deny what they saw. Takeaway moments reinforced the point every few weeks. A guard returning from furlough described seeing the Chicago stockyards processing 18,000 cattle in a single day. Another mentioned that Detroit had produced more vehicles in a month than Germany could in a year. Each number landed like a hammer. The prisoners remembered their own homes, bombed factories, wrecked bridges, silent power plants. The contrast was not only visible, it was mathematical, undeniable. Even recreation revealed the scale. American soldiers received baseball gloves, Coca-Cola, and cigarettes by the carton. Prisoners watched games played with crowds cheering, smelled the tobacco smoke curling in the evening air, and realized these were not luxuries, but normal pastimes. In Germany, sports fields had become allotments for potatoes, and cigarettes were traded like currency. To see such leisure during total war shattered the Nazi image of decadent collapse. Still, disbelief lingered. Some prisoners argued that America's plenty would make its people soft. They claimed that once the fighting reached the homeland, morale would crumble. But each passing month contradicted them. New divisions shipped out, new aircraft filled the skies, and new ships left the slips. The abundance was not diminishing, it was accelerating. By 1945, American factories produced more than 96,000 aircraft in a single year. The figures appeared in camp newspapers, read aloud by guards with casual pride. For Germans, the sound of those numbers was heavier than any sermon. The impact on ideology was subtle, but real. A prisoner might insist that Germany's culture was superior, yet still marvel at the taste of fresh oranges shipped from Florida. He might sneer at capitalist waste, but linger over a glossy magazine photo of a new automobile. The senses betrayed the slogans. When you smelled gasoline at every filling station, heard the buzz of electricity in every building, and saw children eating ice cream in wartime, belief in scarcity as destiny faltered. Some prisoners began to write cautiously about it. One diary from Arkansas recorded, "Here even the poor have radios. They do not fear tomorrow's meal. How can such people be defeated?" Another from Texas described the clang of hammers in a shipyard and concluded, "This sound is louder than any speech." Such testimonies spread quietly, whispered between bunks, reinforcing the conviction that abundance itself was America's greatest weapon. Yet the story did not end with observation. The next stage brought German POWs into direct contact with this engine of plenty. Under the Geneva Convention, they could be assigned labor, and soon they were working on farms, in lumber camps, and occasionally in factories under guard. There, the lessons grew sharper. Not only would they see America's capacity, they would feel it in their hands through tools, soil, and machines. And what they experienced next would test the very foundations of their ideology. The work details began as routine, but for many German prisoners they became the crucible where illusions collapsed. The Geneva Convention allowed captives to labor so long as tasks were not directly military, and the United States used that provision to full effect. By 1945, nearly 370,000 German POWs were employed across the country, replacing missing hands in fields, forests, and factories. The assignments carried a paradox. Men captured at war's front now helped sustain the very society defeating them. Farm labor was the most common. In Iowa, Kansas, and Texas, prisoners found themselves marching each dawn toward fields heavy with wheat and corn. The sensory contrast was immediate. Instead of scorched landscapes, they smelled damp earth after irrigation, saw combines the size of barns rolling across open plains, and heard the steady clatter of machinery harvesting bushels by the thousands. One diary entry from a Bavarian farmer's son noted that a single American reaper matched the work of 50 men. He wrote that the sound of the engine destroyed my hope for German victory more than any bomb. The figures confirmed what their senses told them. U.S. crop yields in 1944 reached record highs. More than 1.2 billion bushels of wheat, over 4 billion bushels of corn. Agricultural extension bulletins delivered to camp libraries proudly boasted these numbers. German POWs, accustomed to ration cards that allowed 200 grams of bread per day back home, stared in disbelief at storage silos that swallowed entire harvests. At lunchtime, farmers' wives carried baskets filled with sandwiches, fruit, and bottles of milk. The smell of apple pie cooling on windowsills mocked the scarcity their families endured in bombed cities. Left similar impressions. In northern Minnesota, prisoners wielded saws and axes under supervision. The scent of pine and the crack of timber filled the air. The logs they felled were hauled by trucks to paper mills that churned out thousands of tons each week. Some Germans had seen such mills once in Bavaria, but here the scale was staggering. Smokestacks rising higher, conveyor belts longer, output multiplied tenfold. Camp records noted that one group of 250 POWs in Wisconsin cut over 15,000 cords of wood in a season, labor essential to fuel production. What shocked them most was that they were not abused or starved for this contribution. Instead, they were paid in scrip, which bought toiletries, chocolate, or magazines at camp canteens. Occasionally, prisoners worked in factories. Though barred from sensitive military plants, they were employed in canneries, textile mills, and lumber processing facilities. The clang of machinery, the hiss of steam, and the rhythm of conveyor belts reminded them of home. But here the power never faltered. Lights blazed day and night. Materials arrived on schedule. Workers collected steady wages and unions negotiated breaks. A prisoner who had trained as a mechanic wrote that he could not understand how ordinary citizens live better than German officers. The smell of roasted coffee in a factory cafeteria haunted him, because in Germany, coffee had vanished into memory years before. Humane beats punctuated this labor. Christmas 1944 saw chaplains organizing services where hymns echoed in both English and German. Some camps roasted dozens of turkeys, distributing more than 2,000 pounds of meat for prisoners and guards alike. Red Cross parcels added chocolate, cigarettes, and powdered milk. The scent of pine wreaths decorated barracks. For men expecting cruelty, the holiday atmosphere blurred the lines between enemy and host. One diary described the taste of warm cocoa as proof that civilization still exists somewhere. Medical care reinforced that impression. Camp infirmaries stocked sulfa drugs and penicillin, innovations largely unavailable to German civilians. When influenza swept through a Georgia compound in January 1945, U.S. Army doctors treated every prisoner, logging more than 400 cases with only 2 fatalities. The smell of antiseptic and the feel of clean sheets made some prisoners question Nazi claims that America was barbaric. A sergeant recovering from pneumonia confessed that he had been treated better than his own brother had. In a field hospital outside Minsk, education became another revelation. Several camps organized classes in English, mathematics, and even political theory. University professors, drafted into service or volunteering, taught prisoners who enrolled eagerly. In one Nebraska camp, more than 600 POWs attended courses during the winter. The sound of chalk scratching on blackboards, the rustle of textbooks in German translation, created an atmosphere closer to a college than a prison. Some men studied agriculture, others engineering. For them it was not just pastime. It was a vision of a post-war life where knowledge, not ideology, might determine survival. Yet ideology did not vanish easily. Hardcore Nazis formed secret groups punishing those who appeared too comfortable. In Oklahoma, a prisoner suspected of collaboration was beaten by fellow captives. Guards intervened, but the tension revealed how fragile loyalty had become. Even so, the everyday experience of abundance eroded fanaticism more effectively than punishment could. When you worked beside American farmers who loaned you gloves in winter, or received a bandage from an army medic, the slogans of superiority began to hollow out. Many reveals accumulated. A POW hauling sacks of potatoes noticed that half were discarded because of blemishes. He muttered that in Hamburg such food would have been prized. Another saw that even rural schools had electric lighting and radios, while in his hometown classes met in bombed basements. A group assigned to orchard work in Washington tasted apples so plentiful that many were left to rot on the ground. The sweet smell of fermenting fruit struck them harder than any lecture. Waste on such scale could only mean an economy bursting with excess. Numbers echoed these revelations. In 1945, U.S. canneries processed more than 3 billion pounds of vegetables. Prisoners who stacked crates saw the tally sheets. They compared them to letters from home, where families queued hours for half a pound of butter. American guards joked about gaining weight during wartime, while German civilians shed pounds from malnutrition. The irony was bitter, and it gnawed at conviction. Some prisoners began to write candidly. Corporal noted that, "Propaganda told us Americans were weak, but I see now weakness does not build tractors this large." Another described the sound of church bells in a small town near his camp, ringing not in mourning but celebration, while his family in Cologne lived without windows or roofs. Even sensory details became indictments. The warmth of wool socks provided by the Red Cross, the taste of fresh milk at every meal, the sight of overflowing barns. Not all responses were gratitude. For some, abundance bred resentment. They muttered that America flaunted wealth while Europe starved. A few clung to the belief that technological miracles, jet aircraft, rockets, would balance the scales. But each day of labor belied that hope. When you shoveled grain into silos capable of holding 250,000 bushels, the whisper of secret weapons sounded small. Takeaways accumulated like blows. The POWs saw that America's power rested not merely on soldiers, but on farmers, workers, and families who lived without fear of shortage. They discovered that a factory whistle could be more persuasive than a battlefield victory, that the smell of fresh bread could erode ideology more than a political speech. Slowly, cracks formed. Not every man abandoned Nazism, but many began to doubt. And doubt, once seated, spread. By the spring of 1945, rumors of Germany's collapse reached the camps. Prisoners read newspapers reporting the fall of Cologne, the bombing of Dresden, the encirclement of the Ruhr. They contrasted those stories with the life around them. Trains still running, lights still glowing, food still plentiful. The conclusion was inescapable. The Reich was crumbling under scarcity, while America advanced with surplus. Diaries record sleepless nights, men lying awake with the smell of hay or diesel in their nostrils, replaying the day's sights and wondering what future awaited them. And then came the final act. As surrender loomed, POWs in America had already absorbed lessons through their senses, their stomachs, their work. But the true scale of U.S. power had not yet been revealed. They had seen farms, factories, and camps. Soon they would confront evidence measured not in meals or wages, but in divisions landed on beaches and fleets stretched across oceans. What they witnessed next would prove that America's abundance was not confined to comfort. It was the very force that determined the war's outcome. By the time the war reached its final year, the numbers themselves became overwhelming proof. German prisoners in America had seen barns bursting with grain and factories running without pause. But in 1944, they began to understand how those figures translated into battlefield power. Newspapers distributed in camps carried stories of D-Day, describing 156,000 Allied troops landing in Normandy on a single morning. The scale stunned them. Back home, entire divisions often scraped by on dwindling rations and broken supply lines. Here in print was evidence that America could put an army on the beach with steak in its packs and gasoline in every jeep. The statistics told their own story. Quartermaster reports revealed that during the first month in France, U.S. forces consumed nearly 60 million K-rations and burned more than 100 million gallons of gasoline. Those numbers reached the camps not as propaganda, but as logistical reports reprinted in civilian papers. For German POWs who had once waited days for a single fuel truck, the figures sounded impossible. Yet they were reinforced by what the prisoners had already witnessed. Trains hauling oil tankers by the dozen, convoys of trucks without end, shipyards launching freighters like toys. The sensory cues, diesel fumes, the clatter of rail cars, the smell of fresh rubber tires, were already imprinted in their memory. Now they saw how it powered armies. The Normandy landings also revealed the human cost America could afford. German papers once claimed that the United States would never stomach casualties, that its democracy was too soft. But the numbers from D-Day alone contradicted that boast. More than 4,400 Allied dead, absorbed without retreat. POWs murmured in disbelief that such losses had not slowed the invasion. They contrasted it with Germany's own panic after Stalingrad, where entire armies were shattered for lack of supplies. The comparison bred unease. If America could replace men, ships, and planes faster than they were destroyed, what chance remained? Material evidence piled higher. By late 1944, U.S. aircraft production exceeded 96,000 planes in a year. Fighters, bombers, transports alike. Newspapers boasted of P-51 Mustangs escorting bombers to Berlin and B-29 superfortresses pounding Japan. Prisoners who had labored in machine shops understood what those numbers meant. The smell of oil on their own hands, the sight of engines lined on conveyor belts made the reports credible. They realized each plane represented not only metal, but the rhythm of industry they had touched with their own work. And stunned them further. Figures showed that by 1945, the U.S. Navy launched more than 1,200 major vessels, including carriers and destroyers. The sound of riveting from distant shipyards, the sight of cranes moving steel plates resonated in memory. Some prisoners admitted in diaries that Germany's vaunted U-boats could not keep pace. For every submarine prowling the Atlantic, 10 new freighters slid into the water. The mathematics was merciless, and it unfolded not in theory but in daily headlines. As these revelations seeped into the camps, the mood shifted. Guards noticed that prisoners who once marched stiffly to work now walked in silence, heads lowered. Ideological groups still held meetings, but defections grew. Men who had tasted Thanksgiving turkey in captivity or studied English at night classes found it harder to believe in slogans about barbaric America. The contrast between propaganda and lived reality widened into a gulf. They had seen abundance not as spectacle but as routine. Refrigerators humming, jukeboxes playing, children eating ice cream during war. It became impossible to reconcile with the idea of a decadent, collapsing nation. By the spring of 1945, Germany itself had collapsed. News of Hitler's death reached the camps through radios and newspapers. Some prisoners wept, others stared in silence. Letters from home told of cities in ruins, families displaced, hunger gnawing. Against this backdrop, the camp mess hall became a haunting comparison. Trays filled with meatloaf, potatoes, and milk. The smell of coffee in the morning carried an almost unbearable irony. Men who had doubted now conceded openly that abundance, not ideology, had decided the war. The aftermath deepened the lesson. As surrender formalities were completed, camps prepared for repatriation. Before departure, many prisoners were taken on supervised tours through American towns. They saw supermarkets with shelves stacked in neat rows, schools with electric lights, hospitals with clean wards. In one account from Arkansas, a prisoner marveled that even rural libraries had more books than his university in Germany had preserved from bombing. The sensory impressions lingered. The hum of neon signs, the taste of Coca-Cola, the smell of gasoline at every filling station. These were not luxuries reserved for elites. They were everyday experiences shared by millions. For some, the realization was bitter. They returned home convinced that Germany had sacrificed generations chasing conquest while neglecting prosperity. A sergeant from Hanover wrote that he had learned more in 2 years of captivity than in 10 years of party rallies. Others carried seeds of change more quietly. They remembered medical treatment received without question, or the kindness of farmers who offered them fruit during harvest. Such gestures haunted them long after uniforms were shed. Numbers again underscored the legacy. By war's end, the United States had produced more than 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and over 2 million trucks. Steel output exceeded 90 million tons annually. Agricultural surpluses fed not only soldiers and POWs, but also Europe's starving civilians. Once relief operations began, German prisoners returning home walked past Red Cross trucks laden with American flour and powdered milk, recognizing the same brands they had seen in camp storerooms. The continuity was undeniable. Abundance at war, abundance in peace. The epilogue of their experience lay not only in memory but in transformation. Historians later noted that many ex-POWs became proponents of Reconstruction, supporting democratic reforms and economic rebuilding. They had seen with their own eyes that freedom and prosperity were not opposites but allies. The clang of American shipyards and the taste of ice cream had conveyed lessons no lecture could. Abundance had undermined totalitarianism more effectively than propaganda ever managed. In the end, victory was not just measured by battles won, but by lifestyles demonstrated. America had shown its captives a society where even prisoners ate better than many free citizens in Europe. The sound of factory whistles, the smell of fresh bread, the sight of endless trains, all spoke louder than ideology. It was victory through demonstration, through dignity, through proof that a system rooted in plenty could outlast one built on fear. As ships carried German POWs back across the Atlantic, many looked out at the horizon with conflicted hearts. They were returning to ruins, yet they carried memories of abundance that would shape their understanding of the post-war world. And when the Marshall Plan began flowing into Europe, it was not entirely foreign to them. They had seen the warehouses, the farms, the production lines. They knew where the aid came from. It was the same force that had fed them steak, eggs, and ice cream in captivity. Epilogue. The war taught that power was not only about weapons, but about the capacity to provide. America's triumph lay in proving that prosperity could endure, even in the storm of global conflict. For German POWs, the lesson was unforgettable. Strength was not terror, but plenty. And for us, their story remains a reminder that abundance itself can be the sharpest blade of all. If you found this journey through history compelling, consider subscribing for our next exploration into how everyday life shaped the outcomes of great conflicts.